Welcome to our ONC listening session, Optimizing Data Capture for Clinical Trials and OSTP. My name is Tom Deneen with Kaufman & Associates and will be assisting with the logistical support for this Zoom session. You can ask questions by clicking the Q&A button, which is located towards the bottom part of your screen. Click on the Q&A bubble icon, and this will pop up the Q&A box, which will open to the right side of your Zoom interface. You may also use the raise hand function under reactions, and we will unmute your line to verbally ask any questions when appropriate. Additionally, we ask that you select the speaker view icon located at the top right side of your Zoom interface. This will allow you to see the speaker as they present or share information. If you need technical assistance during the session, click on the chat bubble icon at the bottom part of your screen, and this will pull up the chat box icon. The chat box will open to the right side of your Zoom interface. Please type the issue into the chat box and one of our techs will respond to you. Finally, please be aware that today's session is being recorded. Closed captions are available by clicking the CC icon at the bottom part of your screen. I will now turn it over to Stefan Konya.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who took time out of their busy schedules to register for and attend today's listening session, Optimizing Data Capture for Clinical Trials. This session is one of two RFI listening sessions this week. We have one today and then a second one tomorrow that are both focusing on two RFIs that were put out by OSTP in partnership with ONC and other federal agencies that focus on what we need to do to build the future infrastructure to support emergency clinical trials. Today's agenda is going to be very simple. We're going to get through our opening remarks as quickly as we can, just to go ahead and set the context for the day and put everybody in the right frame of mind. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the agenda focused on a facilitated roundtable discussion. There are 4 topic areas, 3 of which we know we will definitely get to. The 4th one being a final chat review and sharing of key insights that's going to be dependent on how much time we have left in the schedule. After that, we will quickly wrap it up with some closing remarks and then have you back to the rest of your day. In this discussion, we do want to point out that although the panelists who will be spotlighted that we've invited, the subject matter experts that have a diverse level of experience in industry representation, we are looking for all participants who have registered, all general attendees, to contribute to the dialogue in parallel using the chat feature. You can use the Q&A feature as well. All audience will not see those questions unless we post them or answers unless we decide to post them. But the chat will be public for all to view. And again, we encourage you to have a discussion in real time alongside our panelists that you can see and hear. As far as what an RFI listening session is, if you haven't attended one of these before, in addition to the formal responses that we will receive through an RFI listening session, we're looking to select and garner additional feedback and industry insights as part of this effort. And we want to hear from you. All of you who are on this. So whether it's by participating in the chat today, having discussions on your own outside of this, and then coming back and responding through the RFI process formally, which we do have the links in the back, we want to make sure that you're contributing your voice if you have insights to share as part of this effort. The other piece that we want to highlight is that health equity is the guiding principle in all that we do. I know that Mickey Tripathi, our national coordinator at ONC, as well as the representatives from the White House and the Secretary's Office at HHS, all believe in health equity by design. So as we walk through each of these discussion points, we want to make sure we're highlighting and considering health equity in everything that we're doing. So it's part of the process from the beginning. Also wanted to highlight, if you need more further background on this particular RFI and RFI session, you can click on, as we are going to post these slides, you can click on this hyperlink here, which will take you to our Buzz blog post, or visit healthit.gov to access a little bit more narrative on what this all means. Today, you're going to be spending a lot of time with these individuals here, with myself as an event facilitator. My job is to keep the trains on time and keep things moving. The moderators for the discussion will be Grail Sipes and Jennifer Roberts, both from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, who are leading this RFI work. And then we also have in support other federal panelists, John Rancourt from ONC and Brendan O'Leary from FDA, who will chime in as appropriate and contribute to the discussion as well when appropriate. Now, as far as the subject matter experts we have, you see we have a long list of about 14 subject matter experts that span a number of different industry perspectives and background and a wealth of knowledge across their entire careers in this space. And so we're excited to work with each and every one of them. I encourage you to visit the bio packet, which is also being posted into the chat. You can download it there or visit our website later where it'll be posted as well, and read their full backgrounds if you're not familiar with them. But there's also a good chance you probably do know these faces and these names. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues in the White House Office of Science Technology Policy, Grail and Jen, to walk us through a little bit more background. Grail, Jen?
Yes. Thank you so much, Stefan, and thank you so much to everyone who's here today, all of our tremendous panelists and everybody else who's participating. I'm going to kick us off here with a little bit of background. We're very, very excited to be starting the session here today, and this slide is about how we got here. In the Office of Science and Technology Policy, where I work, we have been looking at a number of issues related to the clinical trials infrastructure in this country. One of them primarily having to do with how to get the clinical trials infrastructure to function more efficiently, respond more quickly in an emergency setting. And in connection with that effort, we have issued 2 requests for information, or RFIs. The first one relates to the effort generally of trying to tackle emergency clinical trials a little bit more efficiently. And that RFI covers a whole range of topics, ranging from should there be some kind of US level governance or coordination? If so, what should that look like? How do we build a more diverse and comprehensive network of sites? As everybody knows, diversity in clinical trials is a major issue in this country. We don't have a diverse enough base of participants, and that is a problem not just for equity and access to investigational agents. It's a problem in terms of the actionability of the data. How do we develop a warm base of clinical research, meaning how do we get enough sites familiar with carrying out clinical trials so that we can have a base that's ready to respond, to surge, or to pivot when we have an emergency, such as an outbreak or another public health emergency? How do we coordinate internationally, and so on and so forth? We also issued a second RFI on data capture for clinical trials, and that RFI is the subject of today's session. And I'd like to say 2 things about this RFI. Well, as you can see on the slide, and I think most of you are familiar with what's in there, some of the key topics are, what are the best strategies for pushing out clinical trial protocols and capturing trial data using common APIs and other techniques that we'll discuss. We also solicited information on how to design a pilot or a demonstration project to operationalize some of this. But 2 things I want to say about this RFI. The reason why we did 2 RFIs in parallel really stems from some of the insights and work of my colleague, Dr. Jen Roberts, who's going to be co-moderating here today. We really felt it was important to spotlight data interoperability and other data issues and try to build that in at the beginning of this sort of policy initiative. Very often the interoperability and data issues kind of get pushed to the end where they can create a huge roadblock. So we really wanted to build it in from the beginning. The other thing that I would highlight is that if you've looked at the RFI, you've seen that what we really want to do is leverage and build on top of the tremendous interoperability frameworks that the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, ONC, has been putting in place. This is an incredibly important part of the picture, and ONC has been a tremendous partner in this effort and in thinking through all of that. We can go to the next slide. Great. Okay, so here I'm just going to give a quick overview of how we're going to approach today's session, and then I'll throw it to Jen to discuss some of the themes. Across this session today, we're going to return to certain themes and scenarios, and I wanted to share one of those up front. So we know that there are a great many data capture solutions in the clinical trial space that have been developed, and many of you out there may be using them, may be very familiar with them, may have been instrumental in developing them. So there's a tremendous amount to work with here. But I think at a high level, what we're trying to tackle is figuring out how to design and execute the best data capture system that we can in a situation where you have an emergency. So you might have a wide variety of clinical sites that all need to carry out the same clinical trial protocol. They might be sites that have not previously worked together. They might be sites that have widely varying levels of experience, but they all need to kind of capture a consistent set of data elements about all the participants in their trials, and to do it hopefully across a more diverse base. You know, what are the best solutions for doing that? So we will be coming back to that scenario. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there up front. And with that, our discussion today is going to be divided across 3 topic areas, and I'll throw it to Jen to discuss those a little bit more.
Great, thanks, Grail. And for each of these topical themes that I'll talk about in just a second, we'll be thinking about these scenarios that Grail has just laid out. So the first topical theme has to do with the design and distribution of clinical trial protocols within an emergency setting. And this goes from designing the protocol itself to also embedding it in software in some way that can be easily distributed, with the understanding that there might need to be some partnerships between those who are doing the technical side, where we are trying to communicate that protocol through software, and those who are on the clinical side, thinking through what that protocol needs to capture in order to be effective. The second topic is really around the execution phase. So how do we think about strategies to capture data during a clinical trial? And also, how do we think about what might be feasible for a pilot demonstration of data capture within a 6 to 12 month time period? Because we're interested in not just talking about what this might look like at the national scale, but also moving towards some demonstration projects. And then the third area is aggregating and analyzing the clinical trial data. So given that we'll be collecting data from many different sites who may or may not have worked together, what are effective mechanisms for pulling that data together in a way where it remains high quality and understandable and easy for folks to analyze so that we can draw valid conclusions? And those are the topical themes. Again, we'll be thinking about the scenarios that Grail outlined throughout them. And back over to you, Stefan.
Thank you so much, Jen. There's been some questions about whether or not we're going to be recording today's session and posting it. If you missed that in the beginning, yes, we will. It'll be posted on ONC's website, the same place you potentially went to register, as well as the meeting materials. These slides at the end of them, the second to last slide, actually has links to both RFIs as well as tomorrow's other RFI listening session. So you can access that in the chat right now. We've posted them. And if you wanted to click in register for those events or review the RFIs, all of that is available in this master deck in the chat, and will also be posted on the website. Great. Okay, so now that we have our minds in the right place and a little bit of context given to why we're all here and what this work is all about, we're going to dive into the discussion. We have those 3 topic areas, and the way that we've divided it up is we have between 4 to 5 of the subject matter experts pre-positioned to help respond to a number of questions that Grail and Jen have in each category. We're going to spend about 20 minutes or so in each of these 3 topic areas where we're going to go a little deeper. One thing I wanted to note, again, encourage you to use the chat for some parallel discussion. We will be monitoring that for key insights and may bring that into the discussion if we see something that we want to highlight. If not, we might do it up. We might bring it in at the end and under the topic 4 section of chat review, time permitting. So please feel free to use that. And again, have these parallel discussions with each other as you're following along. If you're trying to message Grail or Jen in the chat or even in the Q&A, know that they, unfortunately, are not able to see the chat or the Q&A. We are monitoring that for them, and I will be doing my best to catch and bring things up, call them out for them. But unfortunately, they will not be able to see that during this webinar. So I just want to highlight that for everybody. Feel free to message myself, flag it for OSTP, whatever it may be. The other thing is if you are responding specifically to some of the questions within these different topic areas, please just try to put topic 1 in front of your response in the chat. or the insight you're sharing. So that way, when we go back later and go through the chat logs and want to map things, we know exactly which question you're responding to, and we can connect the dots there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Grail and Jen. After I mention who our first 5 panelists are, we've got Nikki Cohen Wolkowitz from Duke Clinical Research Institute. We've got Melanie Iverson with Moderna, Neil Weissman with MedStar Health, Scott Cheatham with Faro Health, and Craig Lipsett with the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance. Each of these subject matter experts have many other affiliations and responsibilities, but we wanted to try to be as succinct as possible in introducing them today so we can get to the discussion. So Jen and Grail, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Stefan, and thanks, Topic 1 panelists. I'm going to kick this one off, and to get us started, I'm going to come back to that scenario I was talking about before. You know, as you remember, in the early stages of the COVID outbreak, we saw kind of a fragmented research response where there were a bunch of, at least in this country, kind of smaller and disconnected studies that got undertaken that you know, wound up with data being stored in different places, and that sort of had the effect of delaying response to the pandemic. In the end, of course, tremendous things were accomplished, but I think we're trying to get to how to change sort of those processes in the future going forward. So coming back to that scenario where you might have a lot of different sites who are not familiar with each other coming together to carry out a common protocol to address an emergency, what's the best way to think about data capture? I mean, we asked about a number of different things in the RFI, you know, the role of CDI, FHIR APIs, Smart on FHIR APIs, CDS hooks, all these different things are at different stages of adoption and viability. But since we're in the design phase here with Topic 1, what are your comments? What are your thoughts on ways to think about this in the pre-emergency phase? What is a good way to design data capture for that type of setting? Stop there.
And I think just a clarifying point at this part, we're interested in the protocol design piece, and we're interested in the protocol distribution piece. Thanks.
Perhaps.
Okay, well, Jen, I see Craig raised his hand, and Mel also, I believe, wanted to chime in.
Mel, do you want to get us started?
Sure, happy to. So thank you so much for inviting me to be on the panel today. This is such an interesting and very important topic, and I do think we learned so much from the COVID-19 pandemic. Wonderful to see those learnings having the opportunity to be applied to something new for the future. I would like to just make sure we take a moment to understand the definitions here. So an emergency clinical trial is being conducted in order, I assume, for an EUA authorization to occur, that we are looking at either a vaccine or a therapeutic being authorized under an EUA paradigm in order to help solve the problem that we're trying to solve by the emergency clinical trial.
It could be, but it could also be, it could be a regulatory intent trial of that nature, or it could be a more pragmatic or just data-oriented trial where you're trying to measure the outbreak and figure out, you know, who's sick and what's happening. But yes, good question. Could be the full range.
That's helpful. I think, you know, when you're talking about protocol design and distribution, particularly in light of sites that may have never worked together, most clinical trials are run with sites that have never worked together. So that isn't different in this context. You can work with 100 sites or 300. The chances are some of them will know each other. Certainly in global trials, many will never have worked together. And does that matter? That's probably something that would be interesting to hear the view of other panelists. I wouldn't say under normal clinical trials, it matters. So is there something different about an emergency clinical trial that changes that in some way? For certainly the vaccine development of COVID-19, understanding the design of that study to get a protocol through that was able to operationalize, understanding what the endpoints needed to be at a time when we didn't necessarily even have a standard COVID-19 definition that would lend to data being available for EUA authorization. All of that was being created while those protocols were being designed. So in the case of Moderna, we started the phase 1 in March, the phase 2 in May, and the phase 3 in July. So everything was being done in parallel. And I want to make sure that we really enforce the very important role of the regulators in this, who are helping the researchers identify what is the key data that needs to be collected, and how is that going to be collected, you know, in the case of CDISC standards or the standardization that is available, because when speed is the most important element, keeping things as simple as possible and answering the most important questions is going to be very important. And I think what we learned is this probably isn't the time to throw everything into a protocol that's nice to have, but to spend upfront time understanding what is the key most important clinical question to ask, and then making sure that the sites fully understand what that is. And I think you talked a lot about site distribution and working together, making sure that the sites have the opportunity to provide input, and that the protocol you're designing can be done feasibly as well. And you know, we had 100 sites in our phase 3 trial, which was 30,000 people for the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine. The other manufacturers did something similar. The designs were similar, they weren't identical. There were other different questions, but when you've got multiple manufacturers or researchers working together, making life as simple for sites as possible, I think, is really critical. So that's just some initial thoughts around the design, distribution, and getting the voice of the sites in early as you're working with regulators and what the endpoints need to be.
Those are great comments. One quick clarification. Agree with everything you said. In speaking about sites that haven't worked together, I think I was trying to get to the idea that a lot of thinking of sites that have different data systems is just a piece that I wanted to capture, but absolutely very good point. Please go ahead, Scott. Oh, sorry, Craig, were you going to?
Yeah, Craig, I think Craig's best.
So a couple of great topics are coming up here. First off, there is certainly a wave of some great tools and approaches that researchers are taking today to use data to better design studies up front, to be more agile in their design, and ideally to be able to create not just digitized protocols, but digital protocols that can be distributed. Most of these will be entirely dependent on standards efforts that we have some representatives here from regarding efforts like HL7's Project Vulcan, Transcelerate's digital data flow. To distribute a protocol digitally is one thing. To be able to have an infrastructure that can receive it, import it, make use of it is something that we clearly need to support and need to invest in, but that will take time for infrastructure to come online. Again, not just to design protocols and push a digital protocol, but so that all the different stakeholders on the receiving end can consume it in some standards-based way. Now, we're talking a bit here about sites, and I wouldn't want us to artificially constrain ourselves around the concept of a site. A site is a physical space, and what research needs are investigators, participants, and some form of place where interactions can happen. Some of those places will be conventional research sites as we know them today. Others will be far more expansive in terms of other points of care, other sites, locations in the community, or people's homes. And so that decentralized, distributed, whatever jargon we wish to use, approach here is going to be very important. The concept of a site may look very different, and certainly will in different emergency situations. Investigators are critical, but where these interactions take place, we want to be expansive around so that people in various communities can engage regardless of if there is a traditional research site proximal to them. I think one last note that sticks in my mind with some of the conversation as we're kicking off today is the importance and the opportunity of master protocols to make sure they are part of our solution going forward, in particular in the United States, where we might have lagged behind, say, Europe or other regions that were able to take advantage of shared infrastructure. When we think about master protocols going forward, how might that be part of our interim solution to having a research-ready, a warm infrastructure up and running? How might we look at observational studies that can be kept warm and running surveillance and capturing data that can then introduce interventional arms as they're needed based on different emergency situations? And certainly as we're thinking about that type of master protocol infrastructure in this country, how might that take advantage of both our traditional research sites as we know them today, but also this concept of far more expansive locations to ensure that not only are we able to include diverse participants wherever they may be, but that we're able to have resilience in the event of an emergency when patients or participants may not be able to get to a traditional site as we know them.
Great points. Great points. Scott, I think you're next.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to join today. Look, I think there's a huge opportunity that's come up to leverage technology here. I mean, one of the opportunities is to improve the way protocols themselves are actually designed and developed. As in Microsoft Word lacks, or I should say, words often lack the precision to represent some of the complicated concepts that we're talking about and to understand the downstream implications, particularly for the ability for patients to participate. What does this mean in the day of the life of a patient for a site? Or to Craig's point, to the multiple types of sites that might happen, and how do we precisely represent a CBC? Is often what's written in a protocol, but there's many types of that. If we want to build data lakes, is how do we leverage technology to more precisely define these things at design time, particularly as part of a master protocol that can easily be shared. And there's many initiatives that have been spoken about here to do with digital data flows, CDISC and others, to be able to directly push to these systems and building the infrastructure to be able to take to receive that, because it is being built right now. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to leverage these learnings and the infrastructure that's being developed across the whole space, as we move forward.
Great points. Neil, I think you're next.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. I've heard the word sites and investigators mentioned many times, and that's what I represent. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer for MedStar Health, an integrated healthcare delivery network in the Mid-Atlantic with 300 points of care, of which we have research at 50 different locations. And I want to make the point that one research study is not like another research study, and the environments in which we carry them out are critically important to what we need to do to set ourselves up to be research ready. So Grail, as you introduced this, you were talking about observational studies that were following the spread of disease and interventional studies that we want to test a vaccine. Very different studies, very different environments. Craig, you brought in the decentralized clinical trials and where we're going with research in the home. Again, critically important, but a totally different infrastructure that's going to be needed. So as we set up this foundation, this research-ready network, we really need to set up a couple of different ones. One for observational, which is going to get to your data exchange discussion later. Another one for more the classic in the clinical setting, and then another one that's truly embedded in the community. For the clinical setting, when you're talking about an interventional study that you need subject matter expertise, you got to think about not just the network and the connections and the infrastructure, but the investigators, the patients, the clinicians that are taking care of those patients. And then you got to find a way to plug and play. So again, I appreciate Melanie talking about getting the researchers and the feasibility up front, because all too often we're handed a protocol that just is not possible to do. And we waste a lot of time and effort on that. So we need to spend a couple of extra hours or days to look at that and then package it. And there's a lot of different ways to package it. We all use clinical trial management systems that we could have that protocol that could just get popped into that. There's a number of tools. So I'm going to stop at this point, but I, again, want to emphasize the environment in which we're doing research is going to be very different, and the needs are going to be different in those different environments.
That's great. That is great. Mickey, and then Dirk, and then after that, one other question I want to get to before we wrap this part of the topic. Please go ahead, Mickey.
Sure, girl. Thank you, and thank you for having me. So I agree with a lot of what's been said. I'm going to add a little bit of a different perspective, specifically as it relates to underserved populations and the solutions that are being discussed here. So I think in thinking about any sort of digital inclusion of protocols or distributions, I think having a clear understanding of the health or IT readiness of either sites or community-based organizations in underserved populations is critical to understand how the level of the digital divide and interoperability that can exist in those populations. And going beyond that, I think Melanie mentioned having sites and PIs and coordinators involved in the study design and feasibility. I think having participant voices is equally important. So having and participant voices that are representative of all of the population. So I think that that's also a critical point. And I think in an ideal world, to also engage underserved populations is thinking about the role that community leaders and community-based organizations play, especially as it relates to trust, as these studies are designed and then implemented, and hoping for at some point have the ability to implement individualized protocols. So if we allow participants to have choice in terms of, similar to Craig's point, I want to go to a site, I feel more comfortable having the assessments at the house. So if there's individualized protocols that can allow participants that go through the same assessments of a protocol, but they have the ability to choose some of the aspects of the protocol, I think that's going to help in engagement participants that have traditionally been excluded from clinical trials. And even within underserved populations, they're not a monolith. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, not only depending upon which underserved population you belong to, but also where you live, what's your geographical location, what's your background, etc. So it adds a level of complexity and it's not a quick fix solution, but having that in mind, I think it's important in the design and in the pre-crisis stage so that all that can be incorporated into the study design and then further into implementation.
Yeah, great points, and that's all very significant for consent as well. To try to get consent, thinking about that digital readiness. Dirk, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. I wanted to just add a quick note, an observation that I've sort of made throughout the past 10 years, and specifically during COVID. And that's, I think that there's a big risk always for paralysis through analysis, right? We want to get it completely right, and we want to have the best infrastructure and sort of nail every single problem. And I've seen time and time again that actually gets in the way of deploying a solution in time. And who knows, maybe the next pandemic is 9 months away, right? Let's hope not. But I think we should really keep an eye on simplicity, because what I've seen during COVID is like the most effective trials that randomized patients and fasted, they were just relatively simple and easy to understand. CRFs, they were easy to understand, protocol was easy to understand, and that makes it all easier to also get buy-in from all the stakeholders you need. So I think I'm really thinking of a multi-layered approach here, where yes, we have sort of the moonshot approach that we're building, but I think at the very first stage, we have something very simple. It all relies on the same underlying data models. But if you start with something very simple, they can deploy very fast and that everybody understands. I think that can sometimes yield the best results because you actually have results and you have a high volume that can maybe make up for the depth or maybe lack of quality of data.
Very, very true. Very true. I think it's what we saw with recovery. Amy, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. One thing that I think is really important as we're looking at creating this new world of clinical research is making sure that we're closing the gap between clinical care and clinical research, because there isn't truly a gap there, shouldn't be a gap there, right? Clinical research is part of clinical care. It informs how we care for patients. And so when we're looking at all of these different ways to conduct clinical research, we need to think about the data in itself, and that the data itself needs to be consistent in the way that it is collected and it is exchanged, the terminologies. At some point, I don't know when, clinical research and clinical care started to talk very different languages, terminologies, standards. We need to bring these together. And that way, the hope would be that we could start to embed clinical research into the way that clinical care is conducted. And so now you don't have to go outside and use separate systems or use separate workflows. We would use the same data that was collected for clinical care for clinical research. And that's going to take some work to get there. But I think we need to do that no matter how we're conducting clinical research, whether it be a decentralized clinical trial, we're still collecting data from it, or whether it be that we're doing it a local care model or we're doing it at a traditional site. I think that's a really important part in order for us to be successful and take that bench to bedside or that learning health system concept to really make it put into play.
Thank you so much. Manny, I know we're squeaking in under the wire here, but I see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Now, just a quick point I just wanted to add to what Craig said earlier. I think in addition to the master protocol, is also very important to have like a centralized RFI, because the difficulty in actually getting a protocol and get it into every clinical site is a big challenge. When you start going one by one, it makes it very complicated. So I think we should have like a centralized RFI that once we get it cleared, and we can deploy the study right away.
Absolutely. Sorry, Scott, is that you?
Yeah, it is. Just, I think one final comment I wanted to build on, everyone. I think one thing that really impressed me during the COVID vaccine was that the willingness to share the protocol by the manufacturers in the space. And while it's not always practical to do that, making the information much more accessible is something that could be leveraged as part of a technology platform. And I really think, to everyone's point here, it just builds trust in the community if we can more openly share why are we doing all these things? When are we doing it? And here's the why, and here's what we're measuring. I think the ability to more clearly communicate that and work with patients as the protocol is being developed is going to be critical.
Great comments. Agree with that. And I want to kind of wrap up this topic session because we got to move on to the next one if you want to stay on schedule here. Just a question to sort of keep in your minds as we go forward is to think about one other thing we didn't quite get to was we talked a little bit about the pre-emergency phase. Obviously we've got to do some preparing in the between times to be ready for an emergency. And one thing to sort of think about is what kind of practice runs might be needed to ensure that we're ready to design and distribute a clinical trial protocol that's machine readable, during an emergency. But let me stop there and throw it to you, Stefan, so we can stay on schedule for the next piece.
Great, thank you, Grail. You're making my job easy. Thank you all to all the first 5 panelists and the others who chimed in on that question. I want to encourage people to continue using the chat, especially for any of the panelists who didn't get every thought out. If you have some additional thoughts on this question or on that last one that Grail posed, throw it into the chat for all to see so everybody can see it. And then we have that archived. So we can go ahead and export that and capture it later. And just make sure that you're indicating this is part of topic number 1 versus this is part of topic number 2 in your posting. For everybody else as well, early on, we had some confusion of when to use the Q&A feature for asking questions versus using the chat for asking questions. If it's a question, try to throw it in the Q&A so we can track and handle that and have a thread on a response for that one question. If it's sharing insights or input or your own thoughts, debates, throw that into the chat so to have that kind of opportunity to share your thoughts. All right, so that little housekeeping note, I'm going to go ahead and go back to the share. And our next topic going to be focused on effective strategies to capture data during emergency clinical trials and a feasibility pilot demonstrations of such data capture capabilities. For this session, we've got Ramita Tandon with Walgreens Health, or Walgreens Boots Alliance. We've got Elena Vibach with General Catalyst, investor in many of these technologies, who is on the cutting edge of figuring out which ones are going to be successful in the market. Manny Fambu with Alira Health. Apologies, I don't have Alira Health listed on the slide, but everyone that he's with Alira Health. And then representing Michelle Longamar, unfortunately, she had a last minute, change to her schedule and she wasn't able to make it. But we've got Ali from her team, who's going to be representing Medable, and then Karen Hartman with Mayo Clinic. Grail and Jen, they're all yours.
Great, thank you, Stefan. Great. So to kick off the discussion of data capture, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the different types of ways that we might be capturing data. And I think we already heard some comments on this where perhaps we're capturing data in a clinical setting, perhaps we're embedding the capture in the community or doing some type of observational study. And I think, there's a couple different ways we might also think about the recruitment, where perhaps we are, when we kick off a clinical trial, we're then trying to recruit patients and start data capture from that point on. Or maybe we have a set of patients that already is on standby and has been collecting data for some time to provide baselines. So I'd like to open up the floor for folks to talk a little bit more about how we might think about this data capture during a clinical trial and what types of both technical and I suppose organizational or social considerations we might take into account.
Ali,
please go ahead.
Karen.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to pop in and try and represent Michelle. So great to be part of this panel today. Obviously, I'm actually based in the UK as well, so bringing a little bit of the international flavour to this as well. I think, I fully agree with the earlier discussions around, preparedness, understanding, keeping it simple, thinking about what data we truly need to answer the hypothesis. I think the piece that we touched on a little bit there, but maybe can explore a little bit more also, is bringing our participants in as collaborators into designing and answering that scientific question, so that we start to break down some of the reticence, particularly in some of our broader diversity populations and people who haven't necessarily been the traditional clinical trialist populations before, and actually bringing their voice in early, maybe having pre-trial populations, pre-engagement, people who want to participate in public health research, in generating science, but just don't know what their data would be used for, don't know the constraints around it, don't know who's the custodian of that data. Is it being done in an independent way, so there's maybe a consortium or an independent body that's not seen as political, government, or profiteering from it, that would allow us to build that trust, and that people would opt their data into that would also allow us to understand what's happening to people on a day-to-day basis and help to build up what are those things that we can expect, that we can pull data through the FHIR and other API integrations into a data set. And then what do we need to collect prospectively over and above that allows us to minimize the data collection needed specifically for a clinical trial? Particularly when you think about the start of a clinical trial, the overwhelming amount of medical history data and other information that we tend to collect, that first visit can be very overwhelming. And what we need at that visit is imparting knowledge and information about what's going to happen and how to collect the key data that's going to allow us to measure the drug effect and the safety and efficacy over the course of the study.
Great, thank you. Karen?
Hi, thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. As I'm listening to the other esteemed panelists, I've really thought about kind of 3 to 4 key words. So I think the first thing we really need to think about in this, and as we design this, is patient-centric. Quite a few have talked about that, but as we really think about the patient or the participant at the center of this, and how do we engage, and how do we engage and work with them throughout the clinical trial process, as well as when we're asking them to participate in studies during an emergency situation. I think the other is simplicity. We heard that earlier, and simplicity of protocol design and simplicity of all of the data elements that need to be captured. The more we can really streamline and make that simpler for both the participant, if we're doing distributed decentralized trials and they're needing to provide data or information to us via a tablet or via a diary, however we hear from them. The same with simplicity for our care providers. And then I think flexibility, the flexibility as we move forward in the design of these trials and in preparing for that next emergency. We need to really think for a protocol that might need to be cared for where patients are acutely ill and in hospital systems. And how do we have flexibility in capturing data that's already being collected in our electronic health records, so that we're not asking providers who are already overworked and overstressed in a pandemic to add additional data layers and having to go into another system to provide that data. So where can we pull data that's already there? Thinking about that, really that connection with clinical research as a care option as we think about it that way. So I really think we need to prepare, and as we think of any pilot projects, we likely need to not just have one, but have a couple to think about what might be that best approach. And it'll really depend on what is that next public health emergency. So thanks.
Great, thank you, Karen. Ramita?
Yeah, Jennifer and Grill, thank you so much for having Walgreens and myself joining today. You know, as I'll take on what Karen was saying earlier. I mean, we had some good discussions, and I think around the patient perspective is as critical as many of you know, Walgreens is a retail pharmacy. You know, we've got 9,000 stores and pharmacies across the US. We service about 150 million lives that, you know, come to our stores and pharmacies. And during the pandemic, when things were shut down, patients and consumers were coming into the stores, talking to their pharmacists, and really trying to help navigate a very complex situation, right? So as we think about trials, and we certainly launched our clinical trial business with the goal in mind as we at Walgreens, you know, embark on our healthcare journey and create this healthcare continuum and start delivering healthcare services locally into our communities, we believe clinical trials is part of this healthcare continuum. So it should be a care option that is, you know, part of the holistic offering as we think about patient care. But more importantly, as we look at ways to help patients access clinical trials, we recognize, and we all know, that less than 5% of this nation participates in clinical research. So you've got a lion's share of this nation that don't have the knowledge of what a clinical trial is, don't understand some of the basic mechanics, let alone medical and digital literacy that is, you know, varied across the communities that we serve at Walgreens. So, you know, a couple things that we're doing, you know, on our behalf to at least help move the needle around equity, diversity, and accessibility is a couple things. Number one, we are activating our physical footprint, our pharmacy locations, to become clinical trial centers. You know, during the COVID vaccine, we saw patients coming in. There's a trust. There's an engagement between the pharmacist and the communities that the pharmacists serve. So we believe if we can activate our locations to serve as clinical research centers, we at minimum can drive patients in to come in for some simple, you know, trial visits, screening, diagnostic, and phlebotomy services that we're conducting today. And certainly we're partnering with large healthcare systems because we know that we can't do this alone. And we're certainly not here to disrupt the provider and the patient relationship, but we want to be able to help support that site ecosystem, if you will. And the notion of flexibility. Keep in mind, it is not a one-size-fits-all strategy that we deployed during the vaccination, you know, during the COVID pandemic. There was a tremendous amount of vaccine hesitancy, and we had to put forth, you know, vaccination clinics. We had to engage the communities and really embark what we call the EEE framework, where we had to educate, engage, and empower patients and consumers within the communities to make that decision. So it's not just, you know, for us, it's about making sure we're offering a flexible set of options, whether it's using our physical footprint, whether it's using a hybrid solution where we partner with a number of tech-enabled organizations to help deliver some more module technical solutions to our patients that embrace technology, or a home-based care, right? Because we know that some aspects of healthcare can be delivered in patients' homes. So from a Walgreens perspective, it is really about making sure we're listening to what's happening within our communities and making sure we're elevating the community's voice while we start to bring trials into our communities.
Great, thank you. Nikki and then Elena.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick point as we're thinking about solutions and these pilot studies. You know, one of the things that could be innovative and pretty cool is, you know, when we did a lot of the COVID work and work a lot with communities, they have this sense of the helicoptering effect where we would go into a community and then some intervention would happen, a trial will occur, and then everybody pulls out and the community is kind of left back to where they started before. So one of the things that those lessons learned could be incorporated into these pilots, where communities are approached and the themes that the pilots concentrate may be questions that the communities are interested in. So they know what they need for the community. They know what kind of research questions they want to ask. And because we're interested in figuring out the mechanics in these pilots for, a future crisis, the theme I don't think is that relevant, but if it's coming from the communities, it's something that we can give back to them during these pilots, so that when the next crisis comes in, it's not that we're always taking, but they've already received something from us. We've helped in terms of trying to provide answers to the problems and research questions that they have, and now we can come, with some of our questions. So I think that part of thinking about it from their perspective is like, what's in it for me, and what am I interested in, what's relevant for my community, is something that we often forget. And these actually present a really cool opportunity to shift that paradigm and start in a very different place.
Great. So also grabbing or collecting research questions from the community and bidirectional communication. Lena?
Yeah, Mickey, that's a great point. I think what you're saying is that we need to share the benefits with the community, and that this is a long-term commitment. We won't see communities engage in clinical trial research if their experiences, we show up, we ask them to give their time, their data, they receive care in the context of clinical trials, and then they're abandoned again in a health equity desert. So, just backing up, I'm Elena Vibach. I'm a partner at General Catalyst, and we have a mission in healthcare to transform the healthcare system from a sick care system to a healthcare system, to bend the cost curve, and to expand health access and equity. So those are the underlying 3 principles of everything we do in healthcare. And so one of the great examples, to Mickey's point, of how do you have research that is cutting edge and benefits the community, is actually Variant Bio. They're not a clinical trials company, they're a research company. And they work with various communities around the world to identify novel drug targets. But the principles and practices that they use are very much something that translates to the setting of making sure that in the near term, they provide tangible health benefits to the communities they work with. And long term, they share the economic benefits of their discoveries back to their communities. That's one model to think about, is how do you make sure that the communities participate, not only receive access to clinical research as a care option, but also participate in the economic upside if billion-dollar products are created out of this research. So that diverges a little bit from the question about data capture and protocol. And I think maybe making it a little bit more practical, someone in the chat actually asked, what is a protocol? Define a protocol design and distribution. A protocol today is a Word document. And think of it as a set of activities and descriptions of, here are the enrollment criteria. Here's the data you need to collect. Here are the treatment interactions that you need to do. And everything in a clinical trial context has to follow those steps. It's like a recipe. And the way it's disseminated today is people send PDFs. And if there's a protocol amendment, they send another one. And then the way data is captured today is, for every clinical trial, you take an existing software and build out modifications to that software to electronically capture that data. So you have a pen and paper process and a custom software redesign or development process every single time. And so I think what Scott is talking about is a technology solution that lets you design the protocol digitally, have all of the data elements that are the same, and then propagates that digitally. So in the context of an emergency clinical trial, what you do is you drastically cut down the programming time and also can assess the feasibility. So if I'm capturing this many data elements, how will that experience be for patients? What will that do to patient access? If I set a certain measure, a criteria around a lab measure, which patients will that automatically exclude? Is that unintentionally impacting health equity? So those are some of the things that you can achieve if you have a technology solution that enables protocol design and then data capture in a continuous way.
Grail and I just want to throw, we've got about 5 minutes left in this topic discussion, which we had more time. I know that we've got Manny and then Ramita also has her hand up. And then there's a lot of other panelists, but maybe I might encourage them to use the chat to drop in their additional input so we can have Manny and Ramita close us out for this section.
Great, thanks. And then if folks, as you're making remarks, if you can also comment on what might make sense for a pilot, because we've touched on that briefly, but it would be great if folks had additional thoughts to either add them in comments or in the chat. And go ahead, Danny.
Yes, just to add to what everyone said, I think something that we're missing is how we actually power these studies. For instance, from a statistical point of view, right? It's easier to say, let's go to local communities and design these studies unique to a particular community. But we all know as study sponsors, and if you design these studies, because we are hooked to this model of the p-value, I wonder if it's time for us to start going away from this p-value mindset into that of more of a confidence interval kind of mindset when you go in that direction, right? If you run an emergency situation, we can't necessarily power a study to look at p-values less than 0.005, right? As a way where we could have secondary endpoints that you look at confidence intervals, and we could then add the secondary endpoints that is relevant to a particular community, and then we could have our primary endpoints that we could actually follow a p-value kind of way, because not every endpoint needs to have a p-value less than 0.005. And so maybe it's the right way of thinking about it. That's something we want to challenge, the way we look at it from a statistical point of view.
Wonderful, great point. Ramita?
Yeah, just a final comment as we think about these solutions, particularly on a pilot side, as we look at digitizing protocols or looking at ways to capture data, even using sites or alternative sites in the case of a pharmacy location. I would just encourage folks to think about the patients that, again, don't understand clinical trials. And so whatever solutions that we're putting out there, we've got to make sure that we can bring it down to the level that they understand. I think it was Lena that you said about the why, and make it easy for them to participate, because let's face it, lion's share of this country also, particularly in some parts of our underrepresented communities, don't understand or don't have access to technology. So if we're going to drive technology, we've got to make sure in parallel, how do we activate the communities so that they feel comfortable and then they can access clinical trials in the way we want them to access clinical trials. So that's just my final part, is just making sure that we're keeping in the mind of the communities that we serve.
Great, thanks so much.
Great, I just wanted, and Jen, I wanted to highlight a couple of the comments that were put in by some of the other panelists as well. One is Jane highlighted that it was way harder than she expected to find a trial site and enter the trial, and we need to find a simpler way of connecting those willing participants to trials in these emergency settings and others. I just thought that was a nice, honest moment from Jane, from her past experience and what we need to do about it. The second one I wanted to highlight is Amy, who works very closely with the Vulcan community, and just highlighting the fact that they run these connect-a-thons, and this is a fire accelerator for those who may not be familiar, that looks at developing standards for these types of use cases and research cases, and that it could be an excellent avenue to test the exchange of data, which could then develop into pilots. And she said she would prefer the word pioneer there, but I just wanted to highlight a few of those points as well. Get time for maybe one more comment here before we move on to the next section, if you want.
Anybody have anything else about the pilot? I know folks had remarked having several different ones might be effective. Go ahead, Grail.
Oh, not on the pilots, but just, I don't know if we have time to dig into this, but just something for the chat or for people to think about as we talk about, and great comments about balancing digitizing with, inclusivity and diversity, major challenge. But what's the role for kind of EHR to EDC, systems? To what extent can we pull stuff out of the EHR? Are the EHRs ready for that? I think there's a lot of promise there, but something to think about is what role does that play in this picture? Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, why don't we move on to the third topic area? I'm going to go ahead and switch back. Thank you to all the panelists in that last section. Now, where the first topic was focused on planning the work the right way, the right protocols, and how do we establish that from the start. And the second topic was more about testing how can we actually capture the right data to feed the protocols that's been designed and the design of clinical trials overall, and making sure we can get it. The third topic is really about testing then the ability to capture from multiple sites in a way that's easy to analyze. So, and this includes this different multimodal, maybe non-traditional sites for clinical trials as well, and the emergence of retail clinics and others for providing some of those services. So with that, we've got four panelists featured here. We've got Tony Klapsis with CVS Health. We've got Jane Miles with CureBase. We've got Dirk Arts with Castor and Amy Kramer with Vulcan. So you've been able to see some of their comments already in the chat, and they chimed in a few times. But Grail and Jen, why don't you take them away with this topic, and that'll close us out for the main discussion points.
Terrific. Thank you, Stefan. And I'm going to get us started in this session. Do you want to move the slide off the screen, or? Great. Thank you so much. I'll get us started here with kind of a first question, and then we'll throw it to Jen for some questioning on the trusted exchange framework and the QHINs and that part of it. But again, here, going back to sort of the scenario we talked about, being in an emergency setting and needing to work across a bunch of different sites that may have very different data systems, electronic health record systems, clinical trial management systems, assuming that type of scenario and needing to stand up a trial and gather data, quickly in an emergency, how do we think about the best way to aggregate the data and to sort of integrate the data collected across those multiple sites in a way that is accessible, high quality, statistically meaningful, that researchers can have access to and use. This is a kind of a major goal here. That's the question we wanted to start with. Who would like to jump in on that? Yes, please go ahead.
So this is
Amy.
a passion of mine, as you guys have noticed. So I think we can't wait until there's an emergency, right? And an emergency is an important thing, but we have a responsibility right now for patients, to mothers, to fathers, to clinicians, whether it be physicians or PIs or nurses. We have to start this now and get this infrastructure in place so that when something comes up, it's ready to rock and roll. Where we need to start is really around that idea of getting ourselves aligned between clinical research and clinical care in the terminologies and the standards. I think once we have an alignment with that, we can start to move forward with the technologies and how to put them in place. There's always a component to doing something with data exchange that has around technology, around data standards. But the more challenging one that I find right now isn't that. I think we have the standards that are out there. They may need to be developed. That's why Vulcan came along, right, is to create and extend out the HL7 FHIR standard for clinical research. But there's also this human component in it. And so when we're looking at this, we're looking at, asking these overtaxed healthcare systems that have life and limb at their core points and asking them to work on this for clinical research. And that's why I feel it's so important not to deviate from the way that they're collecting and exchanging data already, but to follow that pathway. So I think there's this real human component that we have to think about. How do we prioritize this? I think Dr. Zos put in the chat something about the fact that we need to have sustainable funding for this because it's going to take a little bit of work. And I think that is a big piece of it, is how do we get it prioritized with the people, whether it be the sites themselves or whether it be local care model sites or whether it be decentralized clinical trials, so that we're getting this infrastructure in place now instead of waiting and doing it and scrambling at the last minute.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And one theme for all aspects of this is getting ourselves into a state of readiness that's kind of continuously operational and not thinking it in terms of like emergencies as separate from the between times, if you want to call it that. Extremely important point. Sorry, Steph, you have to help me with who's next. I think it might be Jane.
I think it was Dirk.
Yeah, I would start with Jane.
I'll defer to him.
Okay, Dirk, then Jane, then Tony.
Thank you, Stefan.
Yeah, I fully agree with what we just said. I think I'm very happy that we're having this discussion because I've seen multiple examples of how difficult it is to get something up and running fast enough to deal with an outbreak, specifically if you want to prevent further harm. And then clearly that's what we're trying to achieve here. So I'm very happy that this is what we're talking about now. The way I see so the challenge here on data harmonization, the way I see it is we should immediately be thinking about data models that can be easily shared and implemented across a wide variety of platforms. And when I talk about data models, I mean data models that are easily extensible and are annotated with ontologies such as SNOMED and LOINC and human phenotype ontology. Basically enough flexibility and sort of interoperability with with other data sources to ensure that the resulting data that is captured through the implementation of these data models can be harmonized easily. Because I think that we should accept that there's not going to be one holy grail solution. We're not going to be able to get every single EHR system in the US to adopt these data models. We're not going to get every single site to participate in a centralized data capture process. So we should build a very robust, anti-fragile approach that can also rely on sort of more syndicated data capture, as in sites want to capture their own data, fine, as long as they use the data model that was defined up front. So I think developing a very robust data model that supports a multitude of pathogens is going to be essential, and making that widely available in actually maybe different standards and different platforms, just to make sure we maximize the coverage there. So what we did is during COVID, we made a forecaster-specific data model that we distributed to all researchers, was basically available for download on our website. And we ended up with 300 data sets that were actually highly compatible and easy to harmonize, even though they built their own extensions on that foundational data model. And then I think if we do that well, we have the opportunity to use either federated learning, for example, for institutes that maybe struggle a little bit with contributing the data or sharing the data, or obviously just the more traditional ways of hey, send us your export and we'll harmonize it. So I think if we adopt a multi-layered approach, continue to focus on that simplicity and develop robust data models upfront that are widely available and require very little effort for implementation, I think that's a key way of making sure we can nail this, and then we can all focus on getting that moonshot in place and streamlining and getting all the data pipes to connect. But I know that's going to probably take years to actually do effectively. So we need backups.
Can I just ask one very quick follow-up question? In the example that you're citing about the data model that was used up front, were there any patterns or were there any obstacles, any problems you realized with some who could handle it and some who couldn't, or was it sort of generally accessible?
No, this was generally accessible, just with the goal of allowing the sort of creation of observational COVID registries as quickly as possible, and it was very effective. Ideally, of course, you streamline it a bit more and set a few more guardrails in place. So, for example, if you want to do an extension on the data model, you have to follow certain rules for annotating the data model, so it continues to be interoperable with the other extensions. And I would love to have a situation where we can sort of top-down enforce the sort of data model implementation across all these things and monitor that people aren't deviating from that, but it's just not realistic. So if we just assume that people are going to go in their own direction, how do we maximize the chances that the resulting data from those initiatives are still going to be compatible with sort of the core data sets that we have?
Okay, got it. Thank you, Jane.
I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. I agree with everything that Dirk and Amy have raised here, and I'm disclaiming that I'm more of the operator than the data expert. So I'm thinking about how do we get people to be willing to share their data, either from their health record as participants or as investigators who've never been part of clinical trials. So they're physicians, but have never had the opportunity. So my thinking is it's building on Dirk's initial comment, design with the end in mind, and simplify, to Amy's comment, so we reduce friction on the data collection elements. But even before that, I think we need to address transparency, and to Mickey's comment, make sure this is not transactional. It's time for us to set a new understanding across the public domain of how clinical trials enable a public health future that we want together. I know that's a big aspirational comment, but if we work only on the technical side and don't address the human side, I don't think we're going to meet our end goal.
Great point. And the whole issue of kind of building trust among participants and interest and a sense of the final goal, as you were saying, the public health goal is a really major part of this. So great point. Tony, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to build on Jane's comment because I really couldn't agree more. When we started in clinical research about 24 months ago, and what we did a lot was really spend time with members, maybe for 6 months before we even hired a single person and took a single step. And really the question was, what are you really trying to solve in your healthcare journey? And what's the role and your willingness to really participate in research? And the findings are consistent with what you might see elsewhere. Most members have never been asked, right? If they are asked, they're asked in a transactional way. And so the challenge is, how do you integrate research into the healthcare journey of Americans, not just in a CVS or even in a Walgreens ecosystem, but I think more broadly. As we've done that, we've learned a lot. We probably educated about 25 million members, enrolled the number across a range of studies. But I think there's more that can be done. I put in the chat, if you pull up to a system level for a second, think about the role that Medicaid, which now has to cover research-related costs uniformly, or Medicare could have. We've used both public programs to solve either quality or public health issues in really substantial ways. And from a broad-based, I'd say, awareness incentive delivery system, I think there's really fundamental ways we can really think about normalizing and integrating research. So again, it's not separate, but it's really just a fundamental part of what we do. The second theme I want to pick up on, it's such a great discussion, and I found myself wondering, well, a lot of it doesn't seem to be pandemic related really at all. So fundamentally, I think what I'm hearing that I appreciate, and we see it really consistently from our members and our patients, is that interest and willingness, as long as you can also integrate research and put it in the community in a way that matters. So I think a lot of the opportunity that we have in front of us isn't just how to prepare kind of that ready model that you can fully upgrade in a pandemic, but fundamentally, if we're solving for integrated and community access, you've actually solved, I think, for a lot of the core infrastructure needs that you really have. And a lot of it, I'll leave it to Derek and Amy and I love going back and forth in this topic in particular, absolutely comes down to data capture. But I think it really also gets into really your first RFI as well, as how you kind of supplement it with the right regulatory flexibility to enable that kind of rapid community adoption even faster, right, than what happened during the pandemic. When you look at what Mal and Moderna and others have done, really just incredible. I think the challenge we have in front of us is how do we make it even easier, right? And based on the foundation they and others have kind of built, I think that opportunity is really out of us.
Excellent comments. Okay, let's go to Amy and then John, and then I want to throw it to Jen because I know there's a lot more to talk about in this section. Amy, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to reiterate Jane's comments because I raised my hand before you put them in, but I think it's a really important piece to close this loop with the data, right? And when I mean closing the loop with the data needs to be going back in near real time to the patients or the study participants, clinicians, and to the patient themselves. Because if I was a participant, and when I am a participant, I want to have that feedback as much as I can of what's going on, especially in an emergency situation. But Tony, we go back and forth and we collaborate on this quite a bit. It's really important not to just do this for that, right? And can we do this and set it up, this infrastructure, for all sorts of disease therapeutic areas? I think the other thing, just to kind of pivot us a little bit, is when we're asking for data, we need to get the buy-in and we need to get people to have the trust, right? It's going back to the people component. There's a technology piece of it, but there's a big piece around trust. And I think that's where we really can leverage our third-party trusted partners, right? Who do people trust in making decisions in their lives? Could it be somebody like their nurses or their clinicians? Could it be their pharmacists? Could it be their clergy? Who are the other trusted parties that are out there that can help us to educate people around what the clinical research can do and what the role that it plays in clinical care, and also how we're going to make sure that we're being good stewards of their data, using it for the right purposes and making sure that we have privacy around this. I think I didn't want to pivot us too much, but I couldn't miss that opportunity because I think it's so key. If we're talking about data, we have to start with who's going to give it to us, and that's the patient. And so I feel like if we use these trusted third parties, we'll be able to make some more inroads with getting more diverse patients involved.
Great. John, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. What great dialogue here. And to build on what Amy was saying about trust, it does go back to what policies are in place and what regulatory frameworks are in place that people trust. And I was hearing what Tony was saying there and wanted to at least bring in the topic of TEFCA, the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement, which is something that I work on and we work on at ONC, and wanting to just raise that on the webinar, that there are several questions in the RFI about that, and how do we move to that future state under TEFCA where research would be an exchange purpose that can work side by side with treatment as an exchange purpose. So just being very clear, the initial approach that TEFCA is taking is not to include research as an exchange purpose, but something we're looking at towards the future. And using this forum, the audience here, we really want to learn the best way to do that. So please do submit your comments. We're really looking forward to reading all that.
And Jen, this sounds like it might be a good segue to you. Shall we move to your questions here?
Right, yes. So building on what John's saying, in what ways can we use the trusted exchange framework and qualified health information networks in order to make it simpler to have the underlying infrastructure achieve these goals that we're talking about in terms of connecting with the communities, in terms of being able to integrate the clinical trials in with clinical care? Are there ways in which that underlying infrastructure can help? And if so, what gaps need to be addressed? Dirk?
Yeah, I think the way I see it, that would definitely be part of sort of the moonshot approach that we want to implement long term, and that we could also ideally use outside of a potential pandemic. And again, I think a lot of the discussion here is highly relevant for all research, and I think it will be amazing if these types of initiatives can be foundational or can be like form a blueprint for how we want to think about clinical research going forward. Having said that, I think we shouldn't sort of get away from what actually happens when a pandemic breaks out, because everyone's going to be scrambling and stocks are going to be crashing down and it's going to be complete chaos. So again, I want to just reiterate on the point of we need to like visualize what it was during a pandemic, and a lot of the things we're discussing here will be quite challenging to do. So I really think this multi-layered approach where we have sort of different tiers of what we're trying to achieve is critical. And I think TEFCA, I think, is part of the long-term, high-quality solution that we're all striving for. What I do think that could be a short-term opportunity is the TEFCA common agreement that has been worked on. I think we should maybe consider extending that for this purpose, because I think what I've seen in COVID is the trust and the willingness to collaborate is one of the biggest barriers to get something off the ground quickly. Like, obviously, it's easy for us to develop a nice data model in our ivory tower, but like, getting everyone to use that and to share their data, that's going to be one of the biggest challenges. So I think the common agreement and having an ongoing relationship with all these communities and sites where there's trust already in place based on this prior work, I think could be really excellent and be a very efficient way to leverage some of the work that has already been done, instead of reinventing the wheel with yet another agreement that now covers pandemic readiness, for example.
Wonderful. So really building on that TEFCA foundation to be able to integrate with research and help us build that foundation. Amy?
Yeah, thank you for asking the question, because I can't type and listen at the same time. Sorry about that. But I'd like to move to the TEFCA and how it can help, right, with research, because I think there's an awesome opportunity there. And I really would like to see us use this. So we can do a lot of types of research with what's already in the qualified health information networks, right? But we can also look at things in randomized controlled trials, like things like every study that starts up is going to want to do a feasibility, and they're going to want to do all these processes. And we're going to go to the site, and we're probably going to go to the same site, and we're going to ask them the same questions, and we're going to collect this. What if we didn't do that? What if we were able to appropriately access these networks and do those feasibilities and be able to follow where the patient population and the disease prevalence is, and not for one sponsor or one researcher, but for everybody? So that way we're saving all that time, all that effort, and that it takes to collect that information. We have one source of truth. We go to it, we know what it is, and now boom, we can go right and move into conducting the clinical research. I think that TEFCA is huge, and I would love to help you in any way to put research into this piece, because it is so important for us as we move forward.
Great, wonderful, thank you. And I believe, Stefan, are we at time for this session?
We are, and actually right exactly on time, and by some miracle. We're gonna shift to the fourth topic, which is really just about chat review and some of the the Q&A that we've been receiving. We're not going to spend too much time on that, unfortunately, because we do want to be able to wrap up and get everybody back to their days. We could have spent easily an entire day, on each of these topics, and these conversations could have gone much deeper. I did want to point out one thing from the chat. This is actually, just recently posted. It was by one of the other panelists. Jane, I don't know if you wanted to go ahead and just turn on your mic and talk a little bit about your point on if you had access to data out of QHINs, you could build better protocols to include our real world data elements and design, and that's what you hope for. Can you expand on that just a little bit?
I guess it is a bit of a dream, but I do think that a lot of the technical systems exist. We just haven't seen this become the norm. So if we could find ways to pull the data out of the QHINs and health records to populate, well, first design the trial, then to populate the standard data elements that are collected as part of clinical care, and then just add the things that are atypical, let's say that, and push it back to the patients. I think we're getting to a state where you're seeing that combination of clinical research and clinical care that many of us are really interested in achieving. But having those standards in place and knowing that the data is going to meet all of your criteria are key for that to work.
Thank you, Jane. Another comment I wanted to highlight from Robert Mangold is feeling that some elements, and reminding, I guess, that some elements of closed environments are still necessary. However, compliance must be maintained. For example, the EDC system cannot store PII data that you would find in an EHR. This makes communication between them more difficult. EHR systems also aren't usually designed to store all study data to be able to share that back with patients. And EDC systems are not used to having a right to delete function in place in order to limit a sponsor's ability to remove data from a study. So some additional feedback that I just thought was really interesting. I wanted to highlight from Robert. Honestly, I could probably read this entire chat because there's a lot of great feedback in here, and not just from the panelists and responding, but also from a lot of the other attendees. So I really do thank everybody for continuing to use the chat and drop all your thoughts in there. And as we're wrapping up, if you have final thoughts, please continue to do so. We're going to keep the chat open all the way up until the top of the hour, and then we'll close it out. With that, I'm going to go ahead and actually, let me see. I got one other thing here from Meredith. It says, regarding my comment that we could have spent all day on this, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine meeting on advancing direct use of healthcare data and research would be great. And maybe we could reach out to our colleagues over at the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine and see if there's any interest in doing that. So thank you for that as well. Now, the Q&A, we did answer a number of the questions in there for those of you who have been following along in seeing that. There's still, I think, a number of open questions there. We're going to try to see if we can answer any more of those before the end of this. And if not, potentially we might be able to answer some of those in a fact sheet or Q&A afterwards. All the meeting materials, a summary of some of the key insights and findings we're hoping to work on as well. And for the entire listening session, which will include some of the things that came out of the chat, we're hoping to post all of that onto the ONC website, the landing page for this event where you would have registered. So if you go to healthit.gov and underneath events, you would now, after today, click on past events, and you should see it there and easily be able to access all the meeting materials and any future postings of the summary notes, etc. With that, let me go back to sharing very minimal slides that we have. All right. I think we're going to just shift right into here for my part on the next steps, and then turn it over to Grail and Jen to close this out. Number one, please consider and make sure, if you haven't already, to review the RFIs. There are 2 of them. I don't think they're overly complex, and they're not too long. I've seen a lot of RFIs that go much longer, and there's some great questions in there that we're looking for feedback on. You don't need to respond to every question in there. If you see one question that touches a nerve and you want to respond to that, by all means, just submit your response to that. It's a 10-page limit, but it's not a 10-page requirement. So feel free to respond to as much or as little of it as you like. All is welcome. Today's session that we covered was focused on what we listed here as RFI number 1. And as Grail and Jed mentioned earlier, there is a second RFI, which tomorrow there's another listening session. And that brings me to the second point: is there's still time to register for that listening session. And you can find that either on the White House's website, or you could access it through this link. Again, the meeting materials, you can click on it. It might make it a little easier for you if you just access that. Maybe we can post them one more time here as a bookend, post those meeting materials into the chat for people who might have joined late and not have access to it in the earlier chat. But that'll be from 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. And it's going to have a slightly different yet complementary discussion, I think, is what I would say. And if you want more background specifically, there is the announcement that highlights the registration page and all of that below. So you can click on that. That was just posted the other day, earlier this week, and that'll explain a little bit more about that other RFI and the other listening session that's taking place tomorrow. So with that, I will turn it over to Grail, and I will turn it over to Jen to close us out with any other final thoughts.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you so much to everyone. Fantastic discussion. I'll just highlight a few themes quickly, and I know Jen will want to jump in too. One thing coming out of this discussion is very clear is, on the one hand, we cannot wait for an emergency to sort of get prepared, and that's definitely not the mindset here. We really want to think about, bringing an awareness of clinical trial research into the care setting, and expanding our network and getting our data house in order in the here and now, which will have many benefits, including preparing us for an emergency. On the other hand, as Dirk and others pointed out, when an emergency does hit unexpectedly, or however you want to characterize it, as it did with COVID, things can start to happen really quickly, and there's an enormous amount of pressure to act. And in that situation, we may need to have kind of a tiered set of plans as to what's going to work when the panic is really starting to set in. Another theme that I think is going to be very important going forward is as we explore technical solutions for digitizing further in the protocol design space and the data capture space, how do we balance that with making sure that we are making what we're doing accessible to all communities, and that we preserve the ability to advance in terms of equity and diversity. Incredibly valuable discussion, and I know that it will be very helpful as we move forward with this whole effort. Jen, over to you.
Great, thank you. And just highlighting a few things that really stood out to me. So I really appreciated the commentary on the need to support multiple types of clinical research in the traditional clinical setting, the observational studies, and embedded in the communities. And really, if we are moving forward with some type of pilot, thinking about those different types of themes. Also appreciated the emphasis on simplicity. We heard about simplicity over and over again for things like the clinical protocol, for things like the data model, but really trying to figure out what is this thing that we can do all as a very large community that's going to be easy for folks to understand and execute on. And just foot stomping things that Grail had said about the strong messages about integration of communities, and how happy we are to hear all of the thoughts that we had on that topic. So integration with communities, also the bidirectional communication with the clinicians, so that as folks are developing the protocols, the clinicians can comment on what is and is not feasible. Very, very important points there. And I especially like the points about making sure that we're providing benefit back to the community. And that can be informational benefits back to the community as the clinical trials unroll. And I do appreciate the point about also economic benefits and whether perhaps there's mechanisms for that. And then finally, we appreciated the feedback on TAFCA and the QHINs and the way in which those efforts might help create common foundations that we could all build upon. So thank you everyone for your participation and the very great, thoughtful and informative dialogue today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Grail. Thank you to all of our panelists. We understand this is a very busy week for many of you. Thank you to all the attendees. To echo Henry's comments, this is not just ONC and OSTP. There's a large number of other federal agencies, our colleagues at FDA. Thank you, Brendan, for attending and being on call to chime in at any moment. And we're looking forward to continuing our discussion and collaboration with all the federal agencies that are doing this much work as we can to support this and have a better system in place for the next large-scale emergency event or pandemic. So again, thank you all. We look forward to sharing and notes, and then following up after the comment period closes with actually then taking some action around some of this. So again, all of you have a great day, and hopefully you'll be able to join us again tomorrow in the additional RFI session. Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.